As artists, often what we think we want is unlimited options, an unlimited vista of ideas, no one telling us what to do, unlimited creativity. It's funny then that often doesn't end up turning out that well. Often creative projects created with no restrictions turn out to be not that great. And often what we really need is constraints. We need creative restriction. And this is something that works across so many different aspects of creative endeavor. In terms of budget, in terms of deadline, in terms of scope, in terms of figuring out what this thing we're making really is. When we don't have any of that restriction, people tend to just kind of seem to go supernova. They sort of melt down and everything kind of closes in on itself. And the results are normally pretty terrible. How often, for instance, do we see amazing, talented directors who early on in their career created masterworks where they were dealing with low budgets and creative restriction and having everyone tell them what to do. They finally get to the point in their career where they have huge budgets. They have no deadline. No one's telling them what to do. In fact, people are probably saying yes. Everyone is just telling them that they're amazing. And often the projects that come out of that just aren't that amazing. They seem to lack some sort of creative energy. Fundamentally, if you take the oppression away from the rebel, you kind of have nothing. You lose the rebellious spirit. There's kind of no reason to exist there. And I think we need this creative restriction often to give us the focus that we need in order to get creative projects across the line. Now, you might be thinking, look, that's a nice problem to have, but actually in the beginning of our creative journey, we often face this challenge. We often have no boss. No one's telling us what to do. No one is even going to pay us anything or give us any restraints because our art isn't really good enough. So often we are the ones making all the choices. And I think this is one of the main reasons why people really struggle to create amazing sort of personal projects in the beginning. So what I want to do in this episode is try and unpack this topic and look at how, as an aspiring beginner artist and also as an experienced old hand, we can use the idea of creative restriction, of creative guardrails, of people telling us what to do, essentially to inspire our creativity and create really, really interesting things. Welcome to the Visual Scholar Podcast. My name is Mcburnie. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. I've spoken a lot about the idea of, I guess, limitation in terms of the sophistication and the complexity of tools that you use. And also the way that often having deadlines and time restraints can really force us to be more creative. And often these are the things that quieten down the editing mind, or us kind of wanting to get the fancy new brush, the new brush pack to learn some new technique and just kind of look at like, hey, what do I have right now? What can I make right now? This is maybe not the ultimate thing that I can create, but often we need this push, this deadline, this pressure, some creative restriction, some restraint, something to kind of push us across the line so we start engaging in the creative practice, which is much more a matter of saying like, hey, as I said, what have I got right now? What can I make? How can I make this thing here the best that it can be? And I think existing in the beginning in this infinity of possibility where kind of almost if you don't start, if you don't put that first line down, then it's never going to be a failure, right? It's never going to be less than what it could potentially be in your mind. I think there's fundamentally a way that restriction and limitation can enhance our experience as artists. And that's really what I want to get into today. Now, I guess this is something, as I said, that can apply to many different aspects of art, and something that I think is sort of worth going deeper on, that I might do an entire different episode on, is the way that often starting with like really simple, even generic ideas can actually be sort of super interesting and valuable as a way to create sophisticated, new, unique ideas that maybe you haven't sort of heard of before and thought of before. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit today, but mostly I'm talking about here how we can use creative restriction to help us think about and define what our creative projects are going to be and how to sort of start them, get them across the line, and again, the role that restriction plays in that. So what does this problem really look like? Let's see if we can go a little bit deeper and sort of look at the ways that this tends to manifest when it comes to building personal projects. And I think, again, that the irony is that, we kind of start in the beginning with very little restriction. And we often have these vague megalomaniacal dreams, right, of infinity, right? Often when we're thinking about creating things in the beginning, our ideas are vague. And part of the creative process is refining your imagination so that, as I often say, your world moves. And we often look at movies and video games and these things move. And so often your imagination moves, which is fine unless you want to become an artist who is an illustrator who's working with a single image on a two-dimensional plane. If you're doing that, it's a massive problem, right? It's a huge problem to be imagining moving images. And likewise, you may think, hey, I've got this cool idea for a thing, and it's kind of this happens and then that happens. If you wanted to make a film with that, you would need to think, well, what's my shot list? Like, how do I actually create a story that functions in the cinematic tradition in that way? And a lot of people in the beginning just don't really understand that that's a whole thing. To think about how you would break that down into shots and look at, like, here's the story, but here's the story told, and here's how we establish shots and create clarity. And maybe that's kind of different for you imagining it because you kind of know where everyone is. But in order to create clarity in someone else's mind, you need to think about how to communicate that through your medium. And we kind of need to develop this ability. But in the beginning, we kind of don't have a lot of these restrictions. We don't have a lot of these restraints. We sort of don't have anything. And I think the problem normally is, this was the case for me, like when I was kind of starting here, and I hadn't done any professional projects. I was kind of like a semi-professional or not really a professional. And I wanted to create comic books or stories to build worlds. And I had a lot of cool ideas, or at least I thought they were really cool. I still think they're kind of interesting. And the problem I would have, I think, is very common to what a lot of students have, is that I kind of didn't actually know what any of them were. Like, I couldn't really tell you what they were, but in my mind, it seemed like they were very good and very interesting. And, I would have these problems that I think a lot of people have, which is like, oh, I've got this really cool story for this thing. And someone would say, well, okay, like, who's the main character? And you'd kind of be like, well, there's not really a main character. This is a very kinetic story. There's a lot of like action, and it's really more about, this thing and that thing. Or you have that other thing where people say, oh, the world is kind of a character unto itself, really. And it's really just a matter of exploring the world because, that really is the character. It's like, no. Like, who is the character in your story? Because the story needs a character. It's the whole point of the story, right? Like, what are they going through? Like, what is their journey? What is this story about? And I just didn't have any answer because I didn't really understand a lot of that stuff. I just kind of had these very vague ideas in my mind. And I think the thing is that often in the beginning that there's no guardrails, there's no restraint. I'm not quite sure whether this is going to be a comic book, whether it's going to be an ongoing series comic book, a graphic novel, a single graphic novel, a 10-page short story, a 3-page short story, whether it's going to be part prose, like whether, I don't really know any of this stuff. It could be a video game. Maybe I should become an indie developer, make my video game. Maybe it should be a children's book, Who knows? Maybe it should be a board game. Maybe it should be a series of prints. Maybe who knows what it is, right? It don't really even have a clear picture of what it should be. And I think the problem is that the more we define these vague, soft, cozy ideas that we often have in our mind, the more we kind of start to realize that the infinity of positivity that is maybe possible with a vague idea that hasn't been realized starts to reduce as soon as you give it form and make it real and actually start to say, well, okay, who is this character? Like, what is this thing actually about? We have to start making choices. And as you make choices, you kind of realize that, like, maybe this thing is not going to be exactly how you imagined. And it's hard to know how to take that. And I think what most people do is they sort of run into some problem where they really have to define things better, or something's not working. They run into the first challenge. And then the sort of solution is to retreat back and kind of just say, well, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, or maybe, whatever. Like there's always an excuse, and we kind of don't actually start the creative process. We don't even begin. Or when we do, often even if people get halfway through, they kind of just run into problems. And like a lot of creative endeavors, you kind of start out and you kind of think you're going to go with option A, and you've got this idea of like, this is my story, and yeah, it's definitely going to turn out like this. And you sort of get halfway through and you're like, oh, actually, option A is like turning out to be a complete nightmare. This is not working at all. But I see just in the distance, there's option B there, and option B looks like maybe that would be an interesting thing. And then you kind of start pursuing that and you're like, wow, this is working. Silly me. I was thinking it was going to be option A that was going to be the final form of this thing. And then it's option B. And then you kind of get to the end and you're like, this isn't working either. But suddenly, through the foggy distance, you kind of scope out option C there and you're like, well, maybe I could save all this thing by just kind of changing it a little bit. And now it becomes like, option C. And, you kind of go through these creative processes and you try ideas, you abandon them, you refine them, you flip them, you change them. And, this is just the creative process. This is often what happens. Not always, sometimes we can kind of really get close to it in the beginning, but, you need to be prepared to make those changes and really see where it goes. And this is terrifying, I think, to a lot of people early on. And I think as soon as you kind of start to feel that, again, our initial response is to edit or to remove ourselves from the process, right? And I think often this is kind of where we sit in the beginning, is that, you have a bunch of vague ideas. We don't really have anyone telling us what to do. And, we kind of never get off the ground, or you sort of get halfway through one of these things and they often just get abandoned. And that's it's just like the frustration of existing as an artist early on, where you don't have any professional projects, you haven't really managed to get one of these things across the line yet, and yeah, it's a bit of a mess. I think part of often what we're dealing with early on is also our desire to create something unique and something interesting, because often you can see the failings of a lot of different creative endeavors around you, and a lot of them do fail, and they do tend to fail when they are kind of generic, stereotypical ideas that are obviously just sort of created for some kind of monetary gain, right? There's a lot of things and markers that we tend to see. And so I think a lot of artists who are genuine about their craft are trying to come up with something interesting, something unique, something that's, really going to sort of push things forward. And so we're often, really kind of not quite so attracted to, these sort of generic ideas, these sort of stereotypes, and we're trying to sort of create something new straight out of the gate. And I think there's something really interesting here about sort of the irony of small generic ideas and how that can actually be really good to inspire a lot of true creativity. And I think that a lot of really good ideas do come from less of this blank page of infinity, and rather from, being restrained and having to deal with making something that is generic into something that's interesting. So I think the next stage that often people may run into is certainly what sort of happened to me, is like the way that I actually learned to complete projects was less through me sort of figuring out how to do them myself, and more through working with other people, trying to work or engage with other writers, trying to create comic books, or, getting concept art jobs, illustration jobs, and having someone else give us a brief. And this is like the ultimate form of creative restriction. Someone saying, I need you to create this specific thing. I need you to be very restrained. And certainly there's a lot of friction with that early on, like figuring out how on earth do you interface with someone else? How do you get really good ideas when someone else is kind of telling you what to do? And look, it's not for everyone, but the thing that I kind of found that was interesting is that, I would often find that I came up with good solutions doing that. And it would feel as if I had a lot of sort of restriction. And I certainly didn't have that sort of infinity that I felt when I was sort of working exactly on the things that I wanted to do. But if I kind of step back and look at the end result of often what happened when someone would pitch me a very specific idea that obviously was maybe not something I would think of myself or that I was that interested in, or the very generic idea, right? Where it's like, here's basically the plot for every boring 80s action movie, right? But often I would find, if I kind of look back and see at what I did, I would often find that like the results of what I did was more interesting because I had to say, how do I make this interesting, right? Like, this is such a boring idea. How do I make this interesting? And I think it's often that creativity that will inspire us to sort of go broad. And because we kind of have this restriction, I think it kind of often frees up that creative potential to, again, try different things and come up with different sort of results. And I often find, again, this kind of duality of like, if I have to sort of come up with a character design and it's sort of for 100% my project, 100% exactly the sort of thing that I want to make, and no one's telling me what to do, there's not a lot of creative problem solving there. Whereas, when I'm working with someone else kind of telling me what to do, I'd often sort of look at it and be like, I was forced to come up with some really interesting solutions, right? And a lot of the actual designs I created there were much better than when I had 100% freedom. So I think there's something here where, you often as a creative professional get good at solving these problems and building your creative muscles when we're kind of working with other people and working in these larger structures of the creative entertainment industry. And I think, sadly, I think a lot of us sort of don't get out of that. A lot of people seem to have a lot of cool ideas of their own, but, it can be a real struggle for them and a lot of people to kind of figure out how to make their own really interesting thing, because you're so used to working with other people's creative restraint. And when they kind of do their own creative project, right, it kind of doesn't have a lot of energy. And I've certainly encountered that myself, coming up with different ideas and being like, there's something to this, right? There's really something to having a brief and working with other people. And I think that provides that creative restraint. It does a couple of interesting things. It really kind of forces you to commit to the process, right? So the other thing is like just getting professional work or working with other people. It provides like accountability. And I think this is the other aspect of this, where there's restrictions in terms of deadline, in terms of you needing to produce something. And these kind of quiet the editing mind that we have, where if it's just our idea and it's just an infinity and there's no deadlines, there's no restrictions, there's no money involved, right? Often like, there's a deadline, you can impose your own deadline, but there's nothing like, if you don't finish this thing, you don't get paid, or you don't get the status of like having this job, or your career progression is maybe stifled, or whatever it is. There's a lot of status involved with working on particular projects. And I think there's something about committing to that sort of opens up creative possibilities for people. So a big part of that is just finishing it, right? It's just being forced to make decisions on the fly and kind of say, well, this is someone else's idea, so I'm just going to try my best. But, you don't quite have the skin in the game that you do with your own sort of creative project. I think the interesting thing here is that, being inspired by other people's creative limitations, other people's ideas. And I found especially like other people's generic, silly, stereotypical ideas is often something that's inspired me to create some of the most interesting stuff that I've sort of created, right? What I found is if I just start with a really simple premise, pretty much every single time, I come up with something really interesting. And I've done this with brainstorming sessions as well, where we'd be doing a live class, right? And we're just sort of thinking, hey, let's work on some brainstorming strategies for illustrations or creative projects. And you kind of just start up like, hey, here's a really silly idea. And then you kind of follow it down the rabbit hole and you kind of find that's actually a really interesting idea. And it's often these thought experiments, these brainstorming sessions that can come up with much, much more vibrant, interesting, unique ideas that you probably never thought of before, versus that kind of vague, like blank canvas, like I've got this kind of warm, fuzzy idea and I'm not quite sort of sure what it is. There's often not really good, interesting, unique ideas there, from my experience anyway. So what can we do to, I guess, add constraint to ourselves? I think a good way I like to kind of think about this is to look at the blank page and just keep adding restrictions and keep adding restraints and guardrails and definitions and things until I get to a point where like ideas start to happen. And I know that's sort of vague, I know that's kind of amorphous, but I think it's a good sort of mental exercise to do. We can think about all the different aspects that could be part of this creation. And the more that you get experienced understanding production and processes and the way that you're actually going to make something and how long it's going to take and how much effort it's going to be and all these different aspects of your creative process for the particular things that you make, the more you're going to be able to give yourself restriction and restraint. That's going to be realistic. But, you can think about the scope, right? Like, how big is this thing that you're trying to make? You can think about the deadline. Is this something with an infinite deadline? Does it have a deadline that's a long way away, or does it have a really short deadline, right? Is it really going to push you? Is it really going to challenge you? What is it about? Like, at its core, do you have an idea about what your story or your series of prints is even about? What genre is it, right? If you're making a story, like, what are the specifics of character? So often people shy away from these questions, and it's one of these sort of interesting aspects of creating creative projects. But you also have things like the style, like how much detail, what audience is this thing actually for? Are you going to deal with stereotypes or archetypes? Like, how do you approach those things? Are you actually trying to create something avant-garde? What is going on here? And I think the more parameters you understand, the more you think about this, even though it's not creative. These things often inspire us to be creative. And I think the more that you can kind of create a brief or structure for the work that you're, trying to create, the more it's going to inspire you to come up with creative solutions. Now, I think the best way to kind of think about this is, again, just to kind of keep adding stuff until you really find that interesting ideas and interesting questions come about. For instance, if I kind of say, okay, I have to create a comic book project, there's an infinite possibility of things that could be. But, maybe if I say, okay, it has to be a sort of 10-page comic book, I'm like, okay, well, then there's a lot of things that aren't possible and a lot of things that are possible. And it gives me a lot of structure. Then if I kind of say, okay, well, it's got to be a romantic storyline. And I'm like, okay, it's a 10-page romantic storyline. All of a sudden, again, this is still vague though. I'm still like, I don't know what that would be. And I'm like, okay, well, the next thing I could say is maybe this is actually also a science fiction genre. It's like a romantic science fiction story. And then you're kind of like, okay, that still doesn't make any sense. Maybe you could say, well, how does that make sense? Maybe it is about the romantic interactions of sort of different alien races and the way that the science and the science fiction of that may change the way that people experience romantic interactions, right? And again, then you're sort of, that's a bit of a dangerous sort of place to be, right? You could sort of fall off the cliff there. But again, now you're sort of starting to think like, that's interesting, right? What would that be about, right? I feel like all of a sudden you're kind of starting to get into a space where you kind of like, I've kind of trapped myself in a corner where like I need to think my way out of it. And now if I kind of say, well, okay, it has to be done by the end of the month. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that changes everything, right? Because now I can't even think about that much. Now I just have to get it done. And then you would say, oh, okay, well, because of that, also you're not going to be able to spend your whole schedule on this, which is going to be black and white. And I'm like, well, okay, well, like what designs would work in black and white? Like, how am I going to do this? So, all of a sudden, this sort of becomes something that's a little bit more real. It has restriction. And then you can just keep thinking about, like, what are the other aspects of this that are undefined? Like, is this stereotypical? Is this trying to be like warm and fuzzy Star Trek style, two aliens, star-crossed lovers meet and, they basically got slightly different facial features? Or is this something far more weird and strange that deals with the deeper psychological ramifications of romance when you're dealing with sort of cross species who might have completely different ways of doing all of these things, right? Again, now you're going down a rabbit hole, right? Like now it's sort of an interesting idea. It started with a very silly idea. It may end up with a silly idea, but at least we're in this creative flow of thinking about how do I kind of get out of here? And I think this really is the difference. It's like when you have a blank page and anything's possible and you're just kind of vaguely filling it with vague feelings and emotions and stories is, every time I make another decision, I'm kind of locking myself in. But if you start with those things in the beginning, then as I have to think my way out, I'm kind of expanding my way out and I'm coming up with more interesting ideas. And I think it's just a very fundamentally a different creative process. It's a different way to think about it. And it feels a lot more creative to try and think your way out of a solution to think your way to a solution, like sort of out of a problem, out of a little corner you've kind of packed yourself into, versus, again, having an infinity of possibility. And then, every time you make a choice, feeling like, now this thing's getting worse and worse and worse. So fundamentally, keep adding ideas and restrictions and things until you get to that point where like you're thinking like, actually, you know what? That's actually an interesting idea. All right, let's look at a couple of really simple takeaways, because it's all well and good to kind of talk about this stuff, but it might be useful to think about how you could actually apply it to some of your work. So I think, if I look at the sort of analytical takeaway, the more sort of thinky way of sort of looking at this, the thing that really kind of strikes me is that we often kind of underestimate the power and utility of starting with very sort of simple, generic, boring, stereotypical ideas. I think often really good things can be born out of that. And I think likewise, we often also underestimate our ability to create very interesting things when we're faced with very boring sort of problems. And this is kind of, it's the other way around. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but I think just understanding how creativity really functions and that we kind of need that restriction. I think the more we can sort of get in that frame of mind, the better. And it really is sort of similar to this idea of thinking about the way that we kind of exist, right? The way that, we sort of work pretty well is through feeling the world around us, right? Of like putting out ideas and then getting something back. This is about sort of pain and pleasure and directing ourselves. And it's similar to what happens if you kind of put someone in a sensory deprivation tank. They kind of cease to exist because they don't have any feeling. They don't have any emotion. They don't have anything to kind of push up against. And I think having that resistance, having the constraint, often inspires us to act. And I think, again, fundamentally, it seems that humans are built pretty well to think quickly on our feet when we're kind of stuffed in a corner, when our back is against the wall. So yeah, really a simple way of kind of saying that would be that maybe our minds kind of need that resistance and challenge to kind of work well, and that they are either designed or evolved, and that's kind of just how it happens. You kind of actually need that in order to get the creative process working. So what could be a practical takeaway where you can actually go away and sort of maybe think about this? I would just try and see if you can remember or think about, meditate on essentially when you've been in those two different creative modalities, right? When you are kind of really feeling as if you're creative and things are working and you've managed to get projects across the line and, you're actually feeling like you're creating good stuff. Like what else is kind of happening there? How does that feel? And contrast that to other times where you've had more of that sort of writer's block, creative block, where you're staring at the blank page, nothing's kind of working, and just see if you can kind of, notice those sort of different feelings, because I think it often is this kind of feeling that we're after in terms of feeling inspired to be creative versus, feeling as if we're not quite sure what to do, right? There's a little bit of that sort of anxiety about making a choice. Now, again, let me know in the comments down below, sort of how that lands and, where you sort of felt one thing or another thing, or, where this whole frame or idea kind of overlays with your, existence. That would be really sort of interesting to know. But, I think just thinking about those two things is worthwhile, right? And see where you can kind of see it actually apply to your life. I think we're all going to have very unique creative personal sort of processes and ways that we function and things that are really going to motivate, you specifically to work. And, some people are going to be very much more, maybe respond to like deadline pressure. Some people are going to respond more to creative pressure, to scope or budgetary restraints, right? Like there's all these things that kind of really just get your creative, sort of juices flowing, so to speak. And, I think that's important for you to just pay attention to it and really respect, because again, this does make a difference, right? This is often the difference between you spending time creatively, having fun and doing a lot of amazing things, and kind of just flip-flopping about and, nothing happens. The main tactic I found that works here is just that, again, often, as I was explaining with the kind of, thought experiment of a comic book, is often, if you kind of just have one generic silly idea and then you're kind of like, oh, that's kind of lame, and then you add another one, you're like, oh, I don't really understand that, and then you add another one and another one. There's kind of a point where I think, like for me anyway, if I like add enough of these things, my brain starts to work and I'm like, well, I now don't really understand what this thing would even be, And in order to kind of rationalize it and think about it, then all of a sudden I kind of just ideas start to happen a little bit better, right? It raises those questions, and we start to ask questions about like, well, how would that work? Like, what is even that? That seems silly. Like, what would be an interesting way of solving that problem, sort of getting out of there? And I think that's sort of what works for me, is to just kind of keep adding stuff until all of a sudden I sort of get a little bit inspired. So that might be also a thought process that may work for you. So if we think about a philosophical or a spiritual kind of takeaway or way to kind of look at this, again, for me, it's interesting to see that when I started out doing this whole thing, like when I was in high school, when I was thinking about like what creativity is and who's creative and whether I even wanted to be creative, right? A lot of, I think, what society tells us creativity is about is unlimited possibility. You can do anything. And I think there's a bit of marketing done where people who, are quite creative sort of talk about, the infinity of creativity and all the sort of different things you can do. And anyway, I really had this feeling that like to be creative was to deal with this sort of infinite possibility and to just be able to kind of come up with any sort of crazy idea. And the idea of kind of working with restrictions and with briefs and, these kind of much more mundane technical things that, that was the antithesis of creativity. And it's sort of interesting to me that they're kind of flipped around, right? That's sort of one of these weird things. And I think, it just sort of speaks to like looking at, okay, this is how we sort of think something should work versus how it actually works. And I think it's really important to, let go of how we think it should work and just kind of really figure out how your creative process functions, like what makes it work for you. And it could just be one thing, one real restraint that kind of really gets everything kind of working. And I often find this is, for me, I work a lot better when I have a lot of deadline pressure, right? When I'm trying to create some ridiculous amount of sort of project stuff, like that's when I really start to think and I'm like, excited about it. And kind of if the deadline is like, very reasonable, I sort of take my foot off the gas a bit, right? Like I stop, right? That sort of energy ceases to be there, right? And so I've just learned to kind of just bite off a little bit more than I can chew, but in a playful way, right? Like not necessarily saying, oh, this is definitely something I have to do, right? It's not make or break. But I find that when I have those kind of larger, loftier goals, that when I sort of expand the scope a little bit, and sort of decrease the deadline a little bit, that it sort of makes me more excited and I start to think in a more sort of creative way. So, that's just one of these peculiarities of sort of how I tend to function. And I think if you can find what that is for you, to really think about what are the vectors, what are the little classifications of things that when you sort of add a bit more restraint or a bit more scope, or you kind of tweak it a little bit, it really just clicks in your mind and you start to think more creatively. And again, I would say like maybe for you, this is again having blank page, right? And you've got infinite options. So maybe that works for you. But again, for me, I've sort of found that, again, a lot of restriction can be really, really useful. And again, it's always, again, sort of ironic how, often really interesting, unique ideas that I never thought of before kind of stem from just looking very, very boring, generic ideas in the face that I thought would be completely useless. And again, when I have an infinity of possibility, often I create very bland, boring nonsense. So anyway, there's always something worth thinking about there. Again, the duality and the irony of that is sort of, again, infinitely interesting. Anyway, that's what we've got time for on this particular episode. Let me know what you thought of this one. This is a very sort of thinky, I guess, sort of amorphous, idea-based episode. But, I think often what we have to do as artists is have these conversations and try and bring a lot of this stuff, which quite frankly belongs in the subconscious. It belongs where you don't really think about it and you just kind of get stuff done and, you don't really know why, and that's fine, right? You don't need to explain this, but, hopefully through bringing some of these things up and, maybe let me know what you thought of this down below in the comments. Or send me an email, tim@thedrawingcodex.com. And I think it can be really useful to have these conversations, to try and think of this as a muscle that you can build, you can get better. And a lot of that is really figuring out how you tick creatively, how specifically you work, and to ignore how you think it should work. and just look at what actually does work. So anyway, let me know what you think of this down in the comments down below. What works for you, what doesn't work for you, whether you've experienced, any of these states, i.e. working on a professional job that seems a little bit silly and yet you kind of managed to come up with some cool ideas, or sitting there staring infinity in the face and, only being able to come up with very, very bland, generic stuff. I'd be really keen to know. Other than that, we'll catch you around on the next one.